Move, baby. Come on. Please. Shonda Hobson's voice cracked through the quiet mansion like a prayer caught between fear and faith. 3 wheelchairs sat abandoned in the middle of the polished oak floor. In front of them, 3 small boys stood, wobbling, trembling, their legs jerking like strings of light, trying to remember how to glow. "Come to me," she whispered, her palms out, shaking as much as they were. "You can do it. One more step." And then, impossibly, one of them did. Neil Graham's phone slipped from his hand. The billionaire who believed in data, not dreams, stumbled backward into the wall of his own office, staring at the live security feed he'd installed just to prove she wasn't doing her job. His triplets, his paralyzed sons, were walking. The screen blurred as his vision filled with tears. He sank to his knees, breath gone, mind blank, heart finally waking from 2 years of silence. He'd spent a fortune trying to fix what doctors called impossible. Now, watching the maid he'd mistrusted kneel in the middle of his living room, holding his children as they took their first steps toward her, Neil realized that the one thing money could never buy was faith. Welcome back, family. If you're settled in and ready for this journey, subscribe now and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Because tomorrow I've got another incredible story waiting for you. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Now, let's begin. The Graham mansion sat on the far edge of Lake Austin, where the water was glass still at dawn, and the silence pressed against the windows like grief itself. Inside, everything gleamed: marble floors, silver fixtures, a chandelier so large it looked like a frozen waterfall, but nothing felt alive. Neil Graham hadn't heard laughter in this house for 2 years, not since that night. His wife, Rebecca, had gone into labor too early. Triplets, 3 tiny lives born in a blur of blood and blue hospital light. And 48 minutes later, she was gone. Cardiac arrest. No warning, no goodbye. Just 3 fragile boys and a note she'd left on the nursery wall. "Love them loudly, Neil, even when it hurts." He read those words once, then he painted over them. Now he moved through his mansion like a ghost in a tailored suit. He still ran Graham Technologies, the data security firm he'd built from nothing, but even that was a front. The meetings, the forecasts, the acquisitions, all mechanical. The world called him Texas's youngest billionaire. He called himself a man keeping time until the end. In the east wing of the house, 3 motorized wheelchairs sat in a row, identical, sterile, expensive. Eli, Caleb, and Noah, his sons, born premature, diagnosed with spastic cerebral palsy. The doctors were gentle but clear. Mobility is highly unlikely. Prepare for a lifelong dependence on assisted devices. Neil heard those words like a death sentence. He'd hired 12 specialists in 18 months, spent nearly $4 million on therapies, equipment, and home care staff. None of it worked. Each caregiver came with bright smiles and hopeful speeches, then left with resignation in their eyes. One stole medication, another his late wife's jewelry. The last one he caught lying about the boy's progress to pad her overtime hours. So Neil did what a man like him always did when he couldn't control the chaos. He built a system. Security cameras in every hallway, sensors on every door, a live monitoring app on his phone. He told himself it was about safety, but really it was about control, watching, verifying, catching the failure before it could hurt him again. The house became a lab, his children, his data points. That was the state of things the morning Shonda Hobson arrived. She wasn't what he expected. No polished accent, no clinical tone, just a woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes and a warmth that felt like sunlight sneaking through drawn blinds. Her resume said she'd spent 6 years caring for seniors and children with disabilities in Houston. Her reference letter, written in looping cursive, simply read, "She loves people back to life." He almost didn't hire her. She spoke too softly, smiled too easily, looked too human for a job that had broken 11 professionals. But the agency was running dry, and his son's primary nurse had quit the night before. So he signed the paperwork, shaking her hand without meeting his eyes. Follow the medical protocol, nothing more, nothing less. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "No improvising, no personal theories. You're not here to inspire them, you're here to maintain them." "I understand." But she didn't. Or maybe she understood too well. That night, Neil sat in his office with the monitors glowing across the wall. Living room, therapy room, nursery. He watched her settle the boys into bed one by one. Instead of clinical silence, she hummed, low, rhythmic, old, something that sounded like a hymn but wasn't. Eli's eyes fluttered toward her voice. Caleb's fingers twitched. Noah, the quietest one, smiled in his sleep. Neil leaned closer to the screen, frowning. He turned down the audio, convinced it was his imagination. But when he turned it back up, Shonda was whispering something he hadn't heard in years. "You're not broken, baby. You're just waiting for your miracle." Neil's jaw tightened. He almost reached for the intercom, almost told her to stop filling his sons with false hope. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there long after midnight, watching a stranger tuck his children in with a tenderness he'd forgotten existed. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stopped believing in something or someone because it hurt too much to hope again? If you have, this story is for you. Subscribe, stay with me, and let's walk through what happens when faith enters the room science has already given up on.
Morning sunlight crawled through the kitchen blinds, painting golden bars across the polished floor. Neil sat at the counter, untouched coffee cooling beside his laptop. On the security monitor mounted on the wall, the therapy room camera flickered on. There she was again, Shonda, moving softly between the 3 wheelchairs lined up in a half circle. The boys looked as still as statues. She didn't rush, didn't fuss, didn't treat them like fragile things. She spoke to them, not like patients, like people. "Good morning, sunshine," she said, brushing Eli's curls back. "Today's a new day, We're gonna try something brave." Neil frowned. Something brave? He zoomed in. Shonda knelt beside Noah's wheelchair, holding a small portable speaker. She pressed play. A faint sound filled the room, slow, bluesy piano chords, the kind that wrapped around you like a Texas summer night. Noah's fingers twitched. She noticed. "You hear that?" she whispered. "That's a groove, baby. That's movement. Music helps your brain remember it knows how to dance." Neil's grip tightened around his coffee cup. Music therapy wasn't in the plan. He opened his phone, thumb hovering over the intercom app, but before he could press speak, Caleb, the quietest twin, made a sound. A soft exhale that almost sounded like a laugh. Shonda froze. Her hand went to her mouth. "That's it," she breathed. "That's your voice. Do it again." Caleb's mouth curved, the faintest smile. Neil stopped breathing. 2 years of sterile rooms and emotionless routines, and now a stranger had coaxed a sound from his son he hadn't heard since the NICU. He dropped his hand, not pressing anything. He couldn't interrupt. He watched. For the next 20 minutes, Shonda moved with a kind of grace that wasn't professional, it was maternal. She played one song after another, shifting their limbs gently in rhythm. Left arm, right arm, little sways, soft stretches. The triplets couldn't follow instructions, but their eyes followed her, always her. Neil leaned back slowly, eyes locked on the screen. His throat felt tight, his chest heavier than it had in months. He didn't understand what she was doing, but for the first time, his house didn't look lifeless. That night he replayed the footage, again, then again. At midnight, when the footage ended, he opened a blank document and typed a note to himself. Observe, don't interfere. He told himself it was data collection, but deep down he knew the truth. He wanted to see if she could do what medicine hadn't. Over the next few days he noticed the changes. The sterile therapy room began to transform. White blankets were replaced with bright ones she'd brought from home, cartoon prints, soft and lived in. A tiny potted cactus appeared by the window. A painted sign reading, "Little steps matter." The air felt different, more like a home, and his sons, they were responding. Eli started turning his head when she sang. Caleb's fingers curled when she spoke. Noah's eyes, those sleepy eyes that always drifted away, began to lock onto her face. Neil saw it all through the cameras. He told himself he was watching for mistakes, but that was a lie. He was watching because he couldn't look away. One afternoon, while checking footage, Neil noticed something else, something that made him pause the video mid-frame. Shonda was kneeling beside Noah's wheelchair, her hands gently guiding his legs in slow, steady motions. She was teaching him to move. Her voice was low, calm, rhythmic. "You know how trees grow towards the light, baby? That's all we're doing. We're growing towards the light." Neil's pulse spiked. Unauthorized therapy. He clicked to zoom in closer, ready to march down there and stop her. But then Noah's leg twitched, moved, a real voluntary movement. Neil froze. He rewound, watched again, the same twitch, small, undeniable. Something inside him broke open just a little, the smallest fracture in the wall he'd built around his heart. He didn't call her, didn't stop her, didn't even breathe for a while. That night, Shonda stayed longer than usual. The night nurse had clocked out, but the therapy room camera still glowed. Neil opened the feed and turned up the volume. Shonda sat on the floor, cross-legged, surrounded by the 3 wheelchairs. She held an old book in her lap, a children's story called The Rabbit Who Couldn't Jump. Her voice filled the room, warm, lilting, alive. "Everyone told him rabbits can't fly," she read softly, but the little rabbit didn't listen. He kept trying, every single day. Neil sat in the dark, staring at the screen. His sons were watching her, really watching her, and for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't just monitoring his house, he was witnessing it come back to life. You know, sometimes the people who heal us aren't the ones with degrees or titles. They're the ones who see us when nobody else does. If you've ever had someone believe in you when you didn't believe in yourself, take a moment to stay connected here. Subscribe, not for me, but for the next story that might remind you of your own miracle waiting to happen. The Texas afternoon light poured through the long glass hallway of the Graham mansion, streaking across the marble like fire. Neil walked fast, his pulse matching the sharp click of his shoes. He'd told himself for days that he was letting this play out to collect data, to see how long before she failed like the others. But this afternoon, something inside him snapped. He'd seen the footage from the morning. Shonda had moved all 3 boys out of the therapy room, unsupervised, into the wide-open space of the living room. There she was moving their legs in sync to music, coaxing their limbs to mimic walking.
Every rational part of Neil screamed this was reckless, dangerous. He stormed down the hallway and pushed open the living room doors. "Mrs. Hobson," he said sharply. The music stopped. Shonda looked up from where she was kneeling beside Caleb, one hand still steadying the boy's trembling leg. Her face was calm, but her chest rose and fell fast. "Mr. Graham?" Her voice was quiet, steady. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Motor pattern repetition," she said without flinching. "It helps the brain build new pathways." "That's not the protocol." She straightened slowly, brushing her palms on her jeans. I know it isn't. Then why are you doing it? He snapped. She looked him straight in the eye. Because your sons deserve someone who tries. The words hit him like a punch. The doctors have been clear, Neil said, his tone rising. They will never walk. The doctors don't know your boys, she replied, her voice still even, but the emotion underneath was sharp. They know charts, statistics, numbers, but I see them. I see what's fighting in them. Neil's throat tightened. You think you know better than the people I've paid millions to consult? No, she said softly. I just know giving up guarantees nothing changes. Silence. He could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock behind him, could feel the heat creeping up his neck. You're filling their heads with false hope, he said, lower now. And when it fails, it's them who will break, not you. Shonda stepped closer, her voice trembling, not from fear, but conviction. They're 2 years old, sir. They don't know what false hope is. They only know whether someone believes in them. Neil opened his mouth but couldn't speak. I promised their mama, God rest her, that I'd never stop seeing what was possible in a child. That's what caring means. She turned back toward the boys, placing her hand gently on Eli's shoulder. You hired me to take care of them. That's what I'm doing. Neil stood there frozen. He wanted to fire her, wanted to remind her that he paid her salary, that this was his house, his children, his rules. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, buried under the grief and the guilt, something small and painful was beginning to stir, something he'd buried with Rebecca. Hope. That night, Neil sat in his office long after midnight, the glow of the monitors casting pale light across his face. The termination letter sat open on his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He'd written those words 11 times before. Different names, same story. But tonight, his hands wouldn't move. He minimized the document and opened the live feed again. The therapy room glowed softly on the screen. Shonda sat on the floor cross-legged, with a small lamp beside her. The triplets were there, all three, gathered in a half circle around her. She wasn't working. She wasn't following any program. She was just there, humming an old song. His eye is on the sparrow. Her voice was low, raw, full of something Neil couldn't name. She touched Eli's hand gently. You did good today, baby. I'm proud of you. She moved to Caleb, adjusting his blanket, even though it didn't need adjusting. You're getting stronger. I see it. I see you. Then she turned to Noah, the smallest, the quietest. She lifted his little hand and pressed it against her cheek. You're not broken. You're just waiting on your turn. Neil's chest ached. He hadn't cried in 2 years. Not when Rebecca died, not during the funerals, not during the diagnoses, not during the betrayals. But watching her now, this stranger he'd barely trusted, sitting on his floor crying for his sons when he couldn't, the tears came. Slow, uncontrollable. He covered his face, shoulders shaking. For the first time, he didn't feel like the master of this mansion. He felt like its ghost, a man watching life happen through screens while a stranger showed his children what love looked like. If this moment touched you, if you've ever realized too late that someone was fighting for what you'd already given up on, stay with me. Subscribe now, not because it's a button, but because some stories remind us how to see again. When the sobs finally stopped, Neil took a long breath and whispered into the empty room, "What if she's right?" He didn't know that by the next evening, that question would no longer be theoretical, because the next time he checked his cameras, his entire world would shatter. The Texas sun was slipping below the horizon, turning the water outside the Graham estate the color of burnished copper. Inside, the mansion was silent except for the rhythmic whir of medical monitors from the East Wing. Neil sat in his office, pretending to read a quarterly report that hadn't held his attention for hours. The cursor blinked across an empty email draft. His phone buzzed once, a motion alert. He ignored it. Then another. Then a third. Neil frowned, picked up his phone, and opened the security app. The motion feed labeled Therapy Room East Wing was glowing red. He tapped it open. At first, all he saw were the 3 wheelchairs, empty and lined against the wall. His chest seized. Empty? His mind raced. Maybe an emergency. Maybe she'd moved them for cleaning. Maybe... Then he saw them.
In the center of the room, framed by the late afternoon light, stood Eli, Caleb, and Noah. Standing, all 3, their legs trembling, small hands gripping each other's for balance. Shonda knelt in front of them, her arms out, tears glistening on her face. "Come on, babies," she whispered. "You can do it, one step at a time. I'm right here." Neil's heart stopped. He blinked hard, certain it was a glitch, a freeze frame, a cruel malfunction in the feed. But then Eli's foot lifted, wobbled, landed, a step. Caleb followed, then Noah. 3 small, uncertain steps, but steps nonetheless. Neil's phone slipped from his fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a crack. He stumbled backward, knees giving way as he sank into the nearest chair. His body shook. His pulse thundered in his ears. This can't be real. But it was. On the phone screen, his sons, the children every doctor said would never stand, were moving toward the woman he'd nearly fired. "That's it!" Shonda cried, her voice trembling. "Look at you! Look at what you're doing!" Eli reached her first, collapsing into her arms. Caleb followed, then Noah. She gathered all 3, pressing her face into their hair, sobbing. I told you we'd get here. I told you miracles don't ask permission." Neil couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process. 2 years of sterile silence, of living behind walls and monitors, and now this. He fell to the floor, back against his desk, tears spilling down his face. He'd buried hope with Rebecca. He'd let science write his children's future, and now faith had rewritten it before his eyes. For several long minutes, he just sat there, shaking, weeping, whispering her name. "Rebecca, they're walking." He didn't know how long it took before he found the strength to stand. When he finally did, he didn't bother wiping the tears. He ran down the hall, past the ghostly photos, past the quiet rooms, toward the East Wing. His legs trembled, his breath caught in his chest. At the door to the therapy room, he stopped. Inside, Shonda sat cross-legged on the floor, his 3 sons nestled in her lap, their faces buried against her chest. The air hummed with the soft sound of her humming. She looked up when she sensed him there. No surprise, no fear, just calm. "Mr. Graham," she whispered. He stared, unable to speak. "How?" His voice cracked. "How did you know?" Shonda looked down at the boys. "I didn't," she said. "I just believed." Something inside Neil broke, the last brittle piece of the man who'd stopped believing anything could ever live again in this house. He dropped to his knees beside them. Eli's small hand reached for his tie. Caleb giggled softly, that same small sound from the camera feed. Noah, the quiet one, lifted his hand and touched his father's face. Neil's breath caught. He pulled all 3 into his arms, holding them like he hadn't since Rebecca's funeral. His tears fell into their hair. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He said it again and again, an apology for every night he'd watched instead of holding, for every morning he'd chosen fear over faith. Shonda's hand rested on his shoulder. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, Neil Graham, the billionaire who thought he could control everything, surrendered. And in that surrender,
He finally felt peace. If you've ever stopped believing that things could change, if you've ever watched hope die in your hands, remember this moment. These boys were written off by the world, but belief rewrote the ending. Subscribe to stay connected, because maybe the story that finds you next will be the one that reminds you it's not over yet. The Graham mansion felt different that night, not quieter, not colder, alive. For the first time, Neil didn't watch his children through screens. He stayed on the floor with them until they fell asleep, all three resting against him. And when he finally carried them to their beds, he whispered what Rebecca used to say before every good night: "Love them loudly, even when it hurts." He tucked them in, turned off the monitors, and let the silence fill the room. But it wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of peace. The next morning, the Texas sky was painted gold, wide and open, stretching endlessly beyond the estate gates. The smell of rain clung to the ground, but the air felt new, clean, alive. Neil Graham didn't wake up to an alarm that day. He woke up to laughter, real laughter. It echoed down the long marble hallway, light, fragile, unsteady, but unmistakably his son's. He froze in bed, disoriented. It had been so long since laughter lived in this house that it sounded almost foreign. Then he heard Shonda's voice, warm, lilting, almost musical. "All right now, slow and steady. You don't need to rush greatness." Neil threw off the covers and went to the window. Down below, in the courtyard, sunlight danced across the flagstones. Shonda stood barefoot on the lawn, guiding Noah's tiny steps between her hands. Eli and Caleb were sitting on the grass, clapping for their brother like he'd just conquered the world. Neil pressed a hand to the glass. The lump in his throat was almost unbearable. He'd spent millions trying to buy what was now blooming in his backyard for free: hope, laughter, life. He made a decision right then. No more watching through screens, no more hiding behind fear. Today, he would be their father again. He walked down barefoot, no suit, no phone, no bodyguards. The sunlight hit him like warmth he hadn't earned. When he reached the grass, the boys froze, startled by his sudden appearance.
Then Eli smiled. The smallest, simplest gesture, but for Neil, it was everything. He knelt in front of them, awkwardly at first, afraid to scare them, afraid he'd forgotten how to touch without breaking something. Shonda stepped back, giving him space. Noah wobbled, lost his balance, and Neil instinctively reached out, catching him just before he fell. The boy giggled, and something in Neil's chest broke wide open. He pulled Noah close, feeling his small heartbeat against his chest, his tiny fingers curling around his collar. "Hey there, champ," Neil whispered, voice shaking. "You kept your promise, huh? You stood up." Shonda's eyes shimmered. She turned away, pretending to check on Caleb's blanket. Neil looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd entered his house, he really saw her, not as an employee, not another risk, but as the woman who'd saved his family's soul. "How did you even know to try?" he asked softly. Shonda smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Faith," she said simply, "and a little bit of stubbornness. My mama used to say, don't let what they call impossible stop you from trying the possible." Neil nodded, eyes wet. "Rebecca would have liked you." Shonda's voice softened. "I think she already does." From that day forward, everything began to shift. Neil canceled his business meetings for the first time in years. He spent mornings in the therapy room, afternoons in the courtyard. He helped Shonda with the boys' new routines, clumsy but eager. She guided him patiently, showing him how to stretch their legs gently, how to position their hands, how to speak to them so they felt seen instead of studied. Sometimes he'd find her humming gospel tunes while preparing their meals. Other times she'd tell stories about her grandmother, about growing up in Houston, where life wasn't easy but love was strong.
The boys responded to her voice like sunlight, and so did he. That evening, Neil sat in the therapy room long after everyone had gone to bed. The air smelled faintly of baby lotion and lavender oil. He opened his laptop, pulled up the camera feeds one last time, and hovered his finger over the Delete All Recordings button. Then he pressed it. The screens went black. For the first time, he realized he didn't need the cameras anymore. He could see clearly now, with his own eyes, in his own home. The next week, a letter arrived at the Graham mansion, hand-delivered, stamped with the logo of a medical research institute in Austin. It was from Dr. Patel, the neurologist who'd first given the diagnosis. The letter read, "Mr. Graham, I have reviewed the latest reports and footage your caregiver provided. I must admit, I'm stunned. I would very much like to reevaluate the boy's condition. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience." Neil smiled. For the first time, the word stunned felt like victory. He found Shonda in the kitchen later that afternoon, humming to herself while preparing pureed fruit. "They're calling it a miracle," Neil said, handing her the letter. She read it, nodded slowly, then met his eyes. "It's not a miracle," she said softly. "It's what happens when love gets a second chance." If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that even in the darkest homes, light can return, don't let it end here. Subscribe, not for the numbers, but for the reminder that belief still changes things, because it does, every single day. In the months that followed, the Graham estate became unrecognizable. The therapy room turned into a playroom filled with laughter and music. The old cameras were replaced by framed family photos, Neil holding all 3 boys, Shonda smiling beside them. The fountain outside, the one that hadn't worked in years, now flowed again, sparkling in the Texas sun. And sometimes neighbors passing by would pause, hearing the sounds of life pouring from the mansion. They'd wonder what had changed, but only the people inside truly knew. That night, as the house fell quiet, Neil stood by the window, watching the 3 small shapes sleeping peacefully in their beds. Shonda entered quietly, placing a folded blanket over his arm. "You're doing good, Mr. Graham," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Please, call me Neil." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Neil." He turned toward her. "Thank you for not giving up, for reminding me to look again." Shonda smiled, warm, humble, infinite. "Don't thank me. Thank them. They were just waiting on you to believe." Neil's voice broke as he looked back at his sons. "I do now." The following spring, the bluebonnets bloomed across the edges of the Graham estate. The only once quiet property, the one reporters used to call the House of Tragedy, now pulsed with laughter, sunlight, and music. The gates, once sealed to the world, were opened that afternoon for the first time in years. A white van with the logo Texas Children's Rehabilitation Center pulled up the driveway. 3 doctors stepped out, Dr. Patel among them, with a clipboard in hand. They were there for reassessment. The same team that once delivered the verdict that broke Neil's heart was now back to witness what they'd called medically impossible. Shonda helped the boys line up in the courtyard, the spring sun catching their curls as they gripped her hands for balance. She was dressed simply, in a pale blue blouse and jeans, her cross necklace glinting just above her collar. Neil stood beside her, nervous but proud. He'd traded his designer suit for jeans and a rolled-up white shirt. There was something freer about him now, a man who finally looked like he belonged in his own home. Dr. Patel greeted them with a smile that couldn't hide his curiosity. "Mr. Graham, I've seen the videos, but I had to see it with my own eyes." Neil nodded, voice quiet. "So did I." Shonda crouched beside the triplets.
"All right, babies, just like we practiced. Don't look at the doctors. Look at Daddy." Eli grinned. Caleb's eyes locked on Neil's. Noah's lip trembled, but Shonda squeezed his hand. "You got this, sweetheart. You remember what we say?" Noah nodded. "We don't quit." She smiled through sudden tears. "That's right." She stepped back. And then, before the doctors, before the cameras, before the man who once buried every hope he had, the three little boys took their steps. Slow, unsteady, miraculous. The courtyard erupted in sound, laughter, applause, sobs. Dr. Patel pressed his hand to his mouth, eyes wide. This shouldn't be possible," he whispered. Neil's gaze never left his son's. "It wasn't," he said softly, "until she believed it could be." He turned to Shonda. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them said everything words couldn't. That night, after the doctors left and the house quieted, Neil walked through the halls carrying 3 small plates of chocolate cake. It had been 2 years since there was a birthday celebration in this house. Today, that changed. The triplets sat at the kitchen island, frosting smeared across their faces. Shonda laughed, that deep, honeyed laugh that could fill a room. Neil watched her from the doorway for a long time. Then he walked in and handed her a plate. "You forgot one," he said, nodding toward the extra slice. "Who's that for?" she asked. "You, for saving this family." Shonda smiled softly. "I didn't save y'all. I just showed you how to see again." "Then that's still saving," Neil said, his voice rough with emotion. After dinner, they carried the boys upstairs. Neil tucked them in himself. No monitors, no cameras, no fear, just the sound of soft breathing and the whisper of Texas wind through the open window. He lingered by their bedsides, then looked at Shonda. "They're sleeping. They know they're safe," she replied. Neil took a deep breath. "You know, I used to think this house was cursed, that every room was haunted by what I lost." He turned toward the window, watching the moonlight slide across the floor. "But now it feels like she's here again, Rebecca, in the laughter, in the way the boys smile." Shonda's voice was gentle. "Maybe she never left, Mr. Graham. Maybe she was just waiting for you to look up." He smiled faintly. "Neil, please, call me Neil." "All right then, Neil." The way she said it carried warmth, not flirtation, but kinship, something sacred and earned. The next morning, Neil called a meeting with his board of directors. For the first time in his life, he didn't begin with numbers. He began with purpose.
"For 2 years, I built things that made me richer, but not better. That ends now." He announced the creation of the Rebecca Hope Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding therapy, research, and early intervention for children with cerebral palsy, and he asked Shonda Hobson to lead it. She froze. "Me? Sir, I'm no doctor." "You're something rarer," Neil said. "You're proof that love can do what money can't." Her eyes filled. "Then I'll do it," she said quietly, "but only if you help me." "Deal," he said, smiling. "If you've ever lost faith that love can rebuild what life has broken, remember this. Hope doesn't need to be loud. It just needs someone brave enough to keep showing up. If this story reminded you of that, subscribe, because kindness still wins, even when the world forgets it can. Months later, the foundation opened its doors in Dallas. The first children arrived in wheelchairs, some silent, some scared. Shonda greeted every single one at the door. Neil visited weekly with his sons, who now ran, not walked, through the halls, laughing as therapists applauded. And every time someone called it a miracle, Shonda would smile and say, "No, baby, this ain't a miracle. This is what happens when you refuse to quit." One evening, as the sun bled red over the Texas horizon, Neil stood by the garden fountain. It flowed now, restored, alive, sparkling in the light. Shonda joined him quietly, wiping her hands on a towel after playing catch with the boys. "You ever think she'd be proud?" she asked softly. Neil nodded, eyes on the sunset. "Every day." He turned to her. "You gave me back my family, Shonda. You reminded me what love looks like when it fights." She shook her head, smiling. "I just reminded you who you already were." They stood in silence as the last of the light faded. The sound of laughter drifted across the yard, the laughter of 3 boys who'd once been told never. Neil whispered, more to the air than anyone else, "Thank you, Rebecca, for sending her." The wind stirred through the bluebonnets, and for just a moment it felt like an answer. Before you go, think about this. Somewhere in your world, there's a person you've written off as impossible. What if they just need someone to believe again? Subscribe to keep hearing stories like this, stories that remind us that the impossible isn't final, it's just waiting on faith. And as the stars rose over Texas that night, the Graham mansion, once silent and cold, glowed with light, laughter, and love. A home reborn, a father redeemed, and one woman's faith proving that miracles don't need magic, they just need someone who refuses to give up.